I'm in somewhat of a different environment than usual. I'm in Grinnell, Iowa. I'm about to give a talk later today in my hotel room. And I thought that while I was just kind of waiting and don't really have that much going on at the moment, that I would do something that I promised to do, which is record a video on the Insurrection Act.
The Insurrection Act.
The Insurrection Act.
We have an Insurrection Act for a reason.
Explain the Insurrection Act a bit, just so you know what it is. I'm not going to make any predictions here, but I think it's useful to pull these things down from the realm of rhetoric that you hear on television, rhetoric that is often left without context or really explanation, and bring it to you as something that you can actually understand and draw conclusions from on the basis of that understanding. I'm going to try to keep this quick. I've been making kind of long videos recently, so I'm going to try to keep this one on the shorter side, and I hope that it's helpful to you. So what is the Insurrection Act? The Insurrection Act of 1807 authorizes the president to deploy military forces inside the United States to suppress rebellion or domestic violence or to enforce the law in certain situations. The statute implements Congress's constitutional authority to, quote, provide for calling forth the militia to execute the laws of the Union, suppress insurrections, and repel invasions, and the Insurrection Act stands as the primary exception to the Posse Comitatus Act, which forbids federal military forces from being used in civilian law enforcement activities. So what does the Insurrection Act do in practice? It suspends the Posse Comitatus Act and allows the president to deploy the military to assist civilian authorities with law enforcement. That could involve anything from soldiers enforcing a federal court order to suppressing an uprising against the government. You saw Presidents Eisenhower, Kennedy, and Johnson, Lyndon B. Johnson, use the Insurrection Act to enforce federal court orders around desegregation and civil rights. That is maybe the prototypical example of its usage for enforcing court orders. President George H.W. Bush utilized the Insurrection Act to call out National Guard to assist with law enforcement after the LA riot.
There are 3,000 National Guardsmen on duty in the city of Los Angeles. I will use whatever force is necessary to restore order.
And that's another example of the other usage of the Insurrection Act. Now, when can the president actually invoke the Insurrection Act? There are multiple sections, and 3 sections in particular are relevant here. Section 251 allows the president to deploy troops if a state's legislature or governor requests federal aid to suppress an insurrection in the state. And this is the oldest part of the law. Section 252 permits deployment in order to enforce the laws of the United States or to suppress rebellion against the U.S. government whenever unlawful obstructions, combinations, or assemblages or rebellion make it impractical to enforce that law in the state in the ordinary course of judicial proceedings, and this can be done without any authorization from a governor or legislature. It's used if there's a full-blown rebellion in a place and the law is simply not being enforced. Section 253 first allows the president to use the military in a state to suppress, quote, any insurrection, domestic violence, unlawful combination, or conspiracy that so hinders the execution of the laws that any portion of the state's inhabitants are deprived of a constitutional right and state authorities are unable or unwilling to protect that right. Section 253 also permits the president to deploy troops to suppress any insurrection, domestic violence, unlawful combination, or conspiracy in a state that opposes or obstructs the execution of the laws of the United States or impedes the course of justice under those laws. Now, the main limitation on the use of the Insurrection Act comes from the Department of Justice, which has taken the position for quite some time that the law is limited by the Constitution and by tradition. What this means is that it is the opinion, or has been the opinion, of the Department of Justice that the law can only be used when a state requests help putting down an insurrection, when a deployment is needed to enforce a court order, or when state and local law enforcement have completely broken down. And, as the Brennan Center for Justice points out, on its face, the Insurrection Act only permits the use of troops to enforce either federal laws or a narrow category of state laws, basically just civil rights protections. Troops could not be used to fight street crime that would go beyond the remit of the Insurrection Act. And finally, no statute can override the Constitution, and so troops deployed under the Insurrection Act cannot violate or may not violate an individual's constitutional rights. They couldn't search a person's home without a warrant. They couldn't suppress people's rights under the First Amendment. The Insurrection Act has never really been reviewed by courts, and it's not clear that a president's determination of what constitutes an insurrection is reviewable by a court. But it is possible, given the Department of Justice's opinion about the appropriate use of the Insurrection Act, that a use of the Insurrection Act that violates that opinion and that cuts against constitutional protections may in fact be reviewable by courts. But it's the kind of thing you'd have to see what happens in practice. Now, what the Insurrection Act isn't is some sort of declaration of martial law. There's actually no provision for martial law in the U.S. Code. Martial law meaning the substitution of civilian law with military law. The Insurrection Act does not do that. But critically, when you use the Insurrection Act, the laws of the state and locality are still in effect. The laws of the federal government are still in effect. And unlike what President Trump seems to think, the Insurrection Act isn't a instant I win button, now we live under a military dictatorship. It does nothing of the sort. That is not to say the president may not try to use the Insurrection Act in that manner, only to say that the law itself doesn't do that. The text of the law does not authorize anything like that. Now, there is a real lack of clear standards in the Insurrection Act. The lack of clear standards for what constitutes an insurrection, the fact that none of this is potentially judicially reviewable, the fact that it's actually quite broad, I think means that the Insurrection Act needs to be seriously reformed, if not repealed altogether. It seems like a ticking time bomb. And the fact that our would-be dictator president seems to see it as a weapon to allow him to seize total power in the country is evidence that it is in fact a ticking time bomb.
I would not have any problem with invoking it if we needed it.
But the point of this video isn't to make predictions about what Trump is going to do or to make predictions about what's going to happen with the law. It's simply to say what the law is. And now that you know what the law is, you can better evaluate claims made about the law. And you can think about politically what it would take to push against efforts to use the law. Because politics, as I have been trying to remind people constantly, still very much matters. And politics is going to shape whether or not this president decides that he has the leeway to use the Insurrection Act in the ways that he would like to use the Insurrection Act. Hope this helped, and I will be back at some point with a longer video on some history stuff that I'm interested in, and hopefully you'll be interested in.